and wore the Queen's colors, but he came to kill. Stay with us, because by the end of this story you'll understand how one quiet soldier stopped a deadly plot without saying a single word. If you believe real courage still matters in today's world, if you respect those who serve in silence and act only when it counts, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell. We share true stories that honor duty, discipline, and quiet strength. And today's might just be the most shocking yet. It was a peaceful morning outside Buckingham Palace. The sky was clear. The guards stood tall in their crimson tunics and black bearskin caps. Tourists gathered, some holding coffee, others snapping photos. Everything looked as it always had, majestic, ceremonial, routine. But among the real soldiers, one man didn't belong. And no one, not even the Queen's guard, was prepared for what he was about to do. The gates of Buckingham Palace opened just after sunrise. A soft golden light spilled across the cobblestone courtyard, glinting off polished helmets and brass buttons. The morning chill still hung in the air, but the growing crowd brought warmth. Families, veterans, young couples, and wide-aged tourists all gathered to witness one of the oldest military ceremonies in the world. The changing of the guard. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. Seniors leaned against the railings, many wearing military pins, remembering the honor and formality of their own service years. There was a quiet reverence in the air, the kind you feel when history seems to breathe alongside you. Among the guards on post stood Sergeant James Ellison, tall, composed, his posture perfectly still. To the tourists, he was part of the ceremony, but inside his mind was alert, scanning, calculating. 20 years in uniform had taught him how to read the silence between movements. Then, something shifted. A man stepped into formation, but Ellison hadn't seen him come through inspection. His gait was perfect, his uniform flawless, but something didn't sit right. He was standing too still. And to a soldier like Ellison, stillness done wrong isn't respect. It's a red flag. Sergeant James Ellison didn't look like a man you'd notice in a crowd, and that was by design. At 34, his body still carried the strength of his service years, but his presence, quiet, focused, measured. He wasn't loud, he didn't posture, but when he moved, it was with purpose. And when he stood still, it was as if the world paused with him. Born in Savannah, Georgia, Ellison had enlisted right out of high school. Raised by a single father who served in Vietnam, James learned early on that real strength wasn't about how hard you hit. It was about how long you could endure without breaking. Over the next decade, he became one of the Army's most reliable operatives, serving with distinction in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He was later recruited into a joint task force focused on close-quarters combat and counterintelligence. Missions classified. Teams small. Outcomes permanent. But after his third deployment, James requested something few expected: a ceremonial post. It wasn't about slowing down, it was about discipline. Through a rare international exchange, he was assigned to the Royal Guard at Buckingham Palace, an honor rarely granted to non-British nationals. But James wasn't just any soldier. His recommendation letter came signed by a U.S. general and 2 British colonels. In full ceremonial uniform, red tunic, black boots, and the towering bearskin hat, he blended in perfectly with his British counterparts. Tourists took his photo, never knowing that the man behind the stillness had once neutralized insurgents in Kabul and rescued civilians from a burning convoy in Helmand. To most onlookers, he was a statue. To those who served beside him, he was a blade sheathed in velvet. But that morning, Ellison's instincts stirred. He'd stood post here 100 times before. He knew every rotation, every face, every step of the choreography, and that's why it hit him hard when a figure entered the formation without notice. At first glance, everything about the man looked legitimate: uniform, crisp, weapon held correctly, face calm, but James saw what others didn't. The man's boots were newer than regulation. His right sleeve bulged slightly, as if concealing something under the cuff. And his eyes, they were scanning, not observing. James didn't flinch, didn't speak. Instead, he let his body settle deeper into position. His breathing slowed, his vision sharpened, because this wasn't the battlefield, but the stakes. They were just as real. And if this man was who Ellison suspected, then the threat wasn't coming later. It was already here, inside the gates. He shifted his weight just slightly, readying his balance without breaking protocol. The tourist didn't notice a thing, but Sergeant James Ellison was no longer on parade. He was on mission. And what happened next would prove that even in the quietest settings, a soldier never truly leaves the battlefield behind. He stood too still. That was the first thing Sergeant James Ellison noticed. A detail so small it would mean nothing to a tourist, but to a man who had spent his life spotting threats in crowded markets, ruined compounds, and silent alleyways. It was glaring. The new guard didn't shift his weight like the others. He didn't adjust the sling of his rifle or blink with the breeze, and his breathing, non-existent, not calm. Ellison didn't look at him directly. He couldn't, not without breaking formation, but he focused on the man's peripheral presence, watching the way a slight pulse ticked in his jawline, how the gloved hand near his belt tensed every few seconds. This wasn't nervousness, this was readiness. Something else was wrong too. The formation was tight, too tight. There were usually 5 feet between each man and ceremony. This imposter had cut that down to 3. Close enough for quick access, close enough for an ambush. Ellison's mind raced. The changing of the guard was only minutes away. Dignitaries had arrived earlier than usual. He'd heard chatter on the internal channel about an unlisted diplomatic presence inside the East Wing. Someone important, someone unannounced to the public. A high-value target, in other words. Ellison knew how these things worked. You get in disguised as a friendly, you blend in, you wait for the right moment, then you strike. And by the time they figured it out, it's already over. Not today. A whisper of movement caught his ear, a brass button brushing a sash. The imposter had just taken something from his coat, very subtly. The tourist didn't notice. A father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders. An elderly woman pointed her phone camera with a smile. But Ellison? He didn't smile. He counted seconds. 1, 2, 3. The imposter adjusted his footing. He's about to move. Ellison knew the timing, knew the rhythm of violence. He'd seen it in a dozen languages, in 100 eyes. The look of someone who's not posturing, not hesitating, just waiting for the signal. Ellison shifted his stance, subtle, almost imperceptible to the crowd. His heel edged back half an inch, his right hand released tension in the grip. He wasn't breaking protocol, not yet, but he was preparing his body for motion. Because if the man to his right reached for a weapon, there wouldn't be time for a warning. No shouting, no commands, just action. Palace security had no idea. The tourists were oblivious. Even the other guards, good men but ceremonial by trade, hadn't picked up on the danger. But Ellison had. He felt it. He had lived it. In Kandahar, it was a man holding prayer beads. In Mosul, a woman with a limp that turned into a sprint. It always began the same way, with a shadow in the crowd pretending to belong. Now that shadow was standing 2 paces away, and as Ellison tightened his jaw, he made a silent promise. If you move first, I move last. The clock above the east wing struck 9. A trumpet sounded from the palace courtyard, the signal for the ceremonial march to begin. Tourists gathered tightly against the black and gold railing, their phones raised, eyes wide with anticipation. Children cheered. Retired veterans stood straighter. reliving memories long tucked away. But Sergeant James Ellison wasn't watching the parade route. He was watching the imposter. In that instant, Ellison saw it, the shift, the faint tightening of the man's left shoulder. The movement was subtle, but to a trained soldier it was a siren. Here it comes. The man reached beneath his red tunic, just below the belt line, where ceremonial guards carried nothing. And then, like lightning, he lunged. It wasn't chaotic, it wasn't sloppy, it was precise, surgical, the movement of a trained killer. The crowd gasped as the fake guard crossed formation, making a straight line toward a side corridor leading to the East Wing, where an unnamed royal guest had arrived moments earlier. But before the assassin could take a second step, Ellison moved. He broke formation, something royal guards almost never do, and launched forward like a linebacker trained in war. His polished boots struck the stone courtyard in a dead sprint. His rifle fell to the ground behind him, clattering uselessly. Ceremony was over. This was now war. The attacker turned, caught off guard by the breach in protocol, but didn't stop. His right hand emerged with a thin-bladed combat knife, forged for speed and concealment. He slashed sideways toward Ellison, aiming for the ribs, but James had seen that move before, in the streets of Ramadi, in the alleyways of Mosul. He sidestepped, pivoted, and struck low, using the attacker's momentum against him. The crowd couldn't see everything, just flashes of red and gold, the blur of bodies, the gasps of shock. With a grunt, Ellison tackled the man onto the stone ground, grabbing the knife hand and twisting it until the blade dropped. With his knee planted square across the assailant's chest, Ellison locked him down, not to kill, but to neutralize. Every movement was controlled, every breath was measured. He wasn't there to make a scene. He was there to end the threat. Palace security finally surged forward, late but alerted by the break in formation. A young officer pointed, shouting, "He's not one of ours." Ellison didn't respond. He didn't need to. The knife lay on the stone path. The assassin, groaning beneath the weight of trained restraint, stared up in disbelief. And Ellison? Blood trickled from a thin cut across his forearm, but his face was calm. Too calm for a man who had just stopped a killing, because Sergeant James Ellison had done this before, just never in a red tunic, and never in front of Buckingham Palace. The crowd fell silent, and in that silence they didn't see a ceremonial guard anymore. They saw a soldier. The would-be assassin lay motionless beneath Sergeant James Ellison's knee, arms pinned, knife kicked away, breathing shallow and ragged. His mission, whatever it had been, was over. But Ellison didn't rise right away. He kept his weight steady, his gaze fixed on the man beneath him. Not out of anger, not for vengeance, but for certainty. Trained soldiers know that chaos can't be assumed over until it's fully subdued. Finally, with palace security now circling, Ellison stood. He didn't pose for the crowd. He didn't wave. He simply retrieved the fallen blade, handed it to the closest officer, and took 2 steps back into attention, blood still darkening the sleeve of his ceremonial tunic. Silence lingered over the courtyard like a blanket. Even the tourists, many of whom had cheered minutes earlier, were now quiet. Phones were still held in the air, but not for spectacle, for history. They had witnessed something most would never forget. Then came the whispers. Who is he? Was that part of the ceremony? That wasn't just a god. And they were right. Colonel Richard Gaines, a senior liaison from the royal household, pushed through the security line, his face pale but composed. He approached Ellison directly, looked him over and nodded with reverence, not just for what he'd done, but for how he'd done it. "You saved lives today," Gaines said softly, "and you never even raised your voice." Ellison said nothing, but his eyes, calm and steady, said everything. Back inside the palace, an emergency review was already underway. Facial recognition confirmed that the attacker was a known mercenary with ties to extremist networks. His method of entry? A forged transfer order complete with falsified credentials. Security gaps would be addressed, but one truth remained clear. If Sergeant Ellison hadn't been there, later that evening an official statement was released to the press. No names were given, no photos shared. The royal family insisted on privacy while investigations proceeded. But the crowd that had gathered that morning, they knew. Many of them stayed long after the ceremony resumed, hoping to see Ellison one more time, hoping to thank him. But he was gone, quietly ushered through a side entrance to be treated for the wound on his arm. He didn't seek recognition, that wasn't why he served. Back in his quarters, Ellison sat alone on a wooden bench, removing his bloodied glove. A young Royal Guard recruit, no older than 19, knocked softly at the door. "Sir, just wanted to say, that was the most courageous thing I've ever seen." Ellison glanced up. He didn't speak, he simply offered a quiet nod, then returned to polishing his boots. Because tomorrow, he'd stand post again. Or same place, same uniform. But this time, the world would look a little closer, and they'd understand that sometimes the man who stands the stillest is the one holding the line between peace and tragedy. Some stories end with fanfare, but the best powerful ones, they end in silence, with a soldier quietly returning to his post, as if the world hadn't just watched him stop something unthinkable. Sergeant James Jellison didn't stop that assassin for applause. He didn't react for attention or recognition. He acted because it was his duty. Because that's what real service looks like, not in words, but in discipline. And perhaps that's the lesson worth remembering today. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice, the boldest post, or the fastest opinion, there's still something sacred about quiet strength, about standing firm when others panic, about knowing when to act and when to simply endure. Ellison's story reminds us that the stillest person in the room may be the one who's already lived through the storm and chosen, through wisdom and will, not to bring it back. It's a story of restraint, of professionalism, and of timeless character. If you've ever served or loved someone who has, you know this kind of courage. And if this story spoke to you, we want to hear from you. On a scale from 1 to 10, how powerful was this story for you? What part hit closest to home? Leave a comment below. We read every single one. And if you believe more people need to hear stories that honor service, quiet dignity, and true heroism, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, tap the bell so you never miss a story that truly matters. Because today, in the heart of London, a man in silence did what thousands heard about and proved that some heroes don't wear capes. They just stand still until the moment they don't.